The first sign of trouble was subtle. It wasn't a blowout fight or some dramatic departure. It was quieter than that, like the sound of a distant train whistling through the fog. But I should have known. I should have seen it coming a mile away. My name is Charles Miller, and in the autumn of 2007, my life started to crumble. Not all at once, of course. It was more like a slow-motion car crash, with each piece of debris spiraling out before my eyes, but I couldn't stop it. The worst part. It wasn't just the financial collapse that wrecked me. It was my marriage to Lizzie. Now, Lizzie, well, she was something else. Beautiful, strong-willed, and fiercely independent. But under that exterior, there was a resentment that festered like a wound. Maybe it had been there from the start, and I was too blinded by love to see it. Or maybe it grew over time like mold creeping through the walls. I couldn't tell you. But by the end of 2007, it had become undeniable. Back then, I was the CFO of a company involved in real estate investments. You might remember the time minus 2008 was just around the corner, and the housing market was teetering on the edge of a cliff. I could see it happening in real time: risky loans, inflated property values, homeowners defaulting left and right. It was chaos. My job had me neck deep in spreadsheets, projections, and damage control, trying to keep the company from going under. Every day felt like a new disaster. But if my professional life was a storm, my personal life was the sinking ship. Lizzie and I had been married for 6 years by then. She had 2 daughters from her first marriage, Helen and Ashley. They were good kids in the beginning, but as they got older, things got complicated. I wasn't their father, and they made sure I knew it. Every argument turned into a war of words, and Lizzie, more often than not, took their side. Money was another issue. Lizzie came from a well-to-do family, and while I had my own successes, she always acted like I wasn't doing enough. When the market started to crash, our arguments about finances became more frequent and uglier. I could see the disappointment in her eyes every time I tried to explain how bad things were. It wasn't just the market, it was us. I still remember the night everything shifted. It was late December, and I was sitting at the dining room table working through another pile of reports. Lizzie walked in wearing that tight, stressed-out expression she'd been wearing more often lately. "You've been at this for hours," she said, arms crossed. "You don't even notice me anymore?" I glanced up at her, but the words on my laptop screen kept pulling my focus back. "Lizzie, I'm sorry, but this is important. I'm trying to keep everything from collapsing." She huffed and shook her head, her long blonde hair catching the light from the chandelier. "And what about us, Charles? You're so busy saving your company, you're losing your family." That hit me harder than I expected. I closed the laptop and rubbed my temples. "What do you want me to do, Lizzie? The market's imploding. People are losing everything. I'm trying to make sure we don't end up in the same boat." "But we already are, aren't we?" Her voice cracked, but there was venom in it too. "We're already sinking, Charles, and you're just watching it happen." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but deep down I knew she wasn't. Things had been bad for a while, and I hadn't been paying attention. Not to her, not to us. But still, I tried to hold on. "We can fix this. We just need to get through the next few months." Lizzie didn't reply. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my spreadsheets and the sinking feeling in my gut that things were already too far gone. I didn't think too much of her leaving the room that night. After all, we'd had worse arguments. But over the next few weeks, things between us grew colder. Lizzie became more distant, and there was something about the way she carried herself that bothered me. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but then little things started to add up. She started working out more often. Not that it was strange for Lizzie to stay fit, but now she was obsessed. Twice a day, sometimes 3 times. And then there were the text messages. She'd keep her phone on her all the time, never letting it out of her sight. I'd catch her typing away late at night or smiling at her screen during dinner. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd brush it off. "Oh, it's just Helen," she'd say. Or, "Ashley needed something for school." I wanted to believe her. But I wasn't stupid. I knew what a guilty person looked like. I'd seen it often enough in my line of work, people lying to cover up mistakes, hiding things they didn't want others to know. And Lizzie was hiding something. Around February, she started spending more time with Nathan Franklin, a contractor she'd hired for some work around the house. Nathan was a smooth-talking, fast-moving kind of guy. You know, the type dresses like a hotshot, drives a truck that's more for show than for work, always has some flashy new project on the go. Lizzie had been talking about renovations for months, but we hadn't agreed on anything. Then, out of nowhere, Nathan was around all the time. He'd show up on weekends, even during the week when I wasn't home. I found tools scattered in the yard, blueprints on the kitchen table, invoices piling up in my inbox. At first, I tried to chalk it up to Lizzie's restless energy. She needed a distraction, I figured. Maybe she was just throwing herself into the renovations because everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. But then there were the looks. The way Lizzie smiled at Nathan when she thought I wasn't looking. The way he always seemed to linger a little too long when saying goodbye. I wasn't a paranoid guy, at least. I didn't think I was, but the pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't want to see. One night, I came home late after a grueling day at the office. The company was teetering on the brink of collapse, and I was running on fumes. I walked in to find Lizzie and Nathan in the living room, laughing over a bottle of wine. The sight of them together, relaxed and carefree, hit me like a punch to the gut. "Hey," Charles Nathan greeted me, all casual, like it wasn't weird at all for him to be in my house at that hour, drinking my wine with my wife. "Hey," I muttered, my voice tight. Lizzie glanced at me, her smile faltering for just a second before she quickly recovered. "We were just talking about the bathroom remodel," she said, waving her hand towards the stack of blueprints on the coffee table. "Nathan has some great ideas for the tile work." I didn't say anything, just stared at them both, my gut twisting. Something was definitely off, but I couldn't prove it, not yet. And so I swallowed my suspicions, just like I swallowed my pride, but the bitterness lingered. In the weeks that followed, my life seemed to drift further from my control. The housing market was unraveling at a pace that left even seasoned professionals like me reeling. Banks were crumbling, foreclosures soared, and investors were pulling out. It felt like the financial apocalypse, and I was caught right in the middle of it. But while the world outside my door was collapsing, inside my home, a different kind of breakdown was taking place, quieter, but no less destructive. Lizzie had grown even more distant. She spent more and more time out, and when she was home, her phone became an extension of her hand. She'd disappear for hours on end, claiming she was at the gym or running errands, but she never seemed to have any groceries or shopping bags to show for it. Every time I asked her about it, she'd get defensive, sometimes even throwing it back in my face, like I was the one being unreasonable. "I can't even go to the store without you interrogating me," she snapped one night after coming home well past 11 p.m. "It's not that, Lizzie, it's just, you've been out a lot lately. I barely see you anymore." I tried to keep my voice calm, but the frustration was boiling just below the surface. "I'm not going to sit around this house all day while you bury yourself in work and ignore me." She rolled her eyes and grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge. "Besides, the gym helps me clear my head." She didn't look at me when she said it. She just turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, staring at the kitchen floor, feeling like a stranger in my own home. I don't know why I didn't push harder. Maybe part of me didn't want to know the truth. Maybe I thought if I ignored the signs long enough, things would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew better. Every night I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was the beginning of the end. My thoughts would spiral images of Lizzie and Nathan together, their laughter echoing in my mind like a taunt. I'd try to shake it off, but once the doubt took root, it was impossible to ignore. And it wasn't just the late nights and suspicious texts. There were other signs too. The way she dressed had changed. Lizzie had always been stylish, but lately her wardrobe had taken a more provocative turn. Tight dresses, low-cut tops, heels higher than she ever used to wear. She said it was because she wanted to feel good about herself, but I couldn't help but wonder who she was really dressing for. Nathan wasn't the only one hanging around more often. Lizzie had started bringing her daughters, Helen and Ashley, back into the fold. They were in their late teens by then, and while I'd done my best to be a good stepfather, our relationship had always been strained. They saw me as the uptight guy who married their mom, the one who worked too much and didn't have time for fun. Over the years, they'd grown more distant, and after some nasty blowouts, they stopped coming by altogether. But now, suddenly they were back laughing with Lizzie, lounging around the house like they hadn't disappeared for the last 2 years. It didn't take long for them to start disrespecting me again. Ashley would roll her eyes when I spoke, barely acknowledging my presence, while Helen would openly make snide comments about how I was always working or never around. "Why don't you just relax?" Helen quipped one evening, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I mean, it's not like the world's going to end if you take a break from your spreadsheets." Lizzie chuckled, not even bothering to defend me. I shot her a look, hoping she'd back me up, but she just shrugged, sipping her wine. I felt like I was standing on the outside, looking in. The three of them were a tight little unit, and I was the outsider, the intruder. Nathan kept showing up too. Sometimes he was there when I got home from work, just hanging around with a beer in hand like he lived there. The renovation project had somehow ballooned into a massive overhaul of the entire first floor, and Lizzie kept pushing for more new countertops, redoing the floors, expanding the kitchen. She claimed it was for resale value, but I wasn't blind. This was about more than home improvements. She was nesting, making plans for a future that didn't include me. One Saturday, I decided to stay home, hoping to catch up on some work in the quiet of my office. But around noon, I heard Nathan's truck pull up. Moments later, he walked in without knocking, a broad grin on his face. "Hey, Charlie boy. Lizzie said you'd be home today." I hated when he called me that. Charles was the name my parents had given me, and I took pride in it. But Charlie boy? It felt like an insult, a diminishment. "What are you doing here?" Nathan I asked, keeping my voice steady as I leaned against the doorframe of my office. "Oh, just wanted to go over some of the plans with Lizzie for the new patio. She's got big ideas, you know." I bet she does, I thought. But instead of voicing the words, I just nodded and turned back to my computer. Lizzie came downstairs a few minutes later, dressed in tight jeans and a tank top that showed more skin than usual. She beamed when she saw Nathan, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in months. "Hey, Nathan," she practically sang, walking over and giving him a hug that lasted just a little too long. I clenched my jaw, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. They moved to the kitchen, where they spread out blueprints and started discussing measurements and materials. Their conversation was full of inside jokes and casual touches, her hand brushing his arm, his laugh a little too easy. I sat there, stewing in my office, every fiber of my being wanting to march into that kitchen and throw Nathan out, but I didn't. Instead, I tried to focus on my work, but it was impossible. Their voices floated through the house, seeping into every corner, every thought. I couldn't escape it. The worst part was that Lizzie seemed happy, genuinely happy, and it wasn't because of me. By the time summer rolled around, the tension between us was palpable. We barely spoke anymore, and when we did, it was clipped and cold. I had stopped asking where she was going, stopped trying to confront her about Nathan. Every time I tried to have a conversation, it ended in a fight, so I shut down. I threw myself into work, hoping the company's problems would be enough to distract me from the sinking ship that was my marriage. But then, something happened that I couldn't ignore. One evening, I came home earlier than usual. The office had been unbearable, the constant barrage of bad news grinding me down until I couldn't take it anymore. I needed a break, so I left before rush hour and headed straight home, hoping maybe I could catch Lizzie in a rare moment of peace. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Nathan's truck parked outside. My stomach twisted. I hadn't expected him to be there, but at this point I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me, though, was the sight of Lizzie through the front window. She was standing by the fireplace, her back to me, talking to Nathan, who was sitting on the couch. They were closer than I'd ever seen them before. I watched, frozen in my car, as Lizzie laughed at something Nathan said. Then, slowly, she leaned down and kissed him. I felt the world tilt beneath me. I couldn't breathe. There it was, the confirmation I had dreaded for months. I had suspected, but seeing it with my own eyes was a gut punch I wasn't prepared for. Lizzie wasn't just cheating on me emotionally, this was real, and it had been happening right under my nose. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. Instead, I drove. I don't even remember where I went, just that I needed to get away. My mind was a whirlwind of rage, hurt, and disbelief. How long had this been going on? Was this why she'd been so distant, why she'd become a stranger, and more importantly, what the hell was I going to do about it? Part of me wanted to confront them right then and there, to walk back into that house and demand answers. But another part of me, perhaps the smarter part, knew that if I did, I'd lose control, and I couldn't afford that. Not yet. No, I needed a plan. Lizzie had been playing me, lying to my face, humiliating me in my own home, but if there was one thing I'd learned in business, it was how to bide my time. You don't react out of anger, you wait. You gather your evidence, build your case, and strike when the moment is right. And that's exactly what I was going to do. I couldn't shake the image of Lizzie kissing Nathan. It was burned into my brain, searing every time I closed my eyes. For days I avoided going home, taking on extra hours at work, anything to stay out of the house. But there was only so much avoidance I could manage. Eventually, I had to return. And when I did, it was like walking back into a war zone, except the enemy wasn't some external force. The enemy was sitting across the dinner table, pretending everything was fine. Lizzie acted like nothing had changed. She still carried on with her gym trips, her errands, and her renovations with Nathan, but I knew better now. I knew what was going on behind my back, and as much as I wanted to blow up, to confront her and Nathan and demand answers, I held back. I needed proof. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this unscathed. So I started keeping tabs. At first, I watched her patterns, the time she left, where she went, and when she came back. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. Nathan's truck would appear at our house almost every time she went out, or when she claimed to be at the gym. It became a sickening routine. Then, one night, I took it a step further. I followed her. It was a Thursday. Lizzie had told me she was going to run some errands and then meet up with the girls for drinks. I played along, acting indifferent, as if I hadn't already figured out her game. When she left, I gave it 20 minutes, then grabbed my keys and headed out after her. I knew where she was going. Nathan had a small property on the outskirts of town, a rundown house he claimed he was renovating but had never gotten around to finishing. It was the perfect place for their little rendezvous. I parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, staying out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline surging through me like wildfire. I couldn't believe I was doing this, sneaking around like some kind of spy in my own life. But I had to know. I had to see it for myself, even if it broke me. As I got closer to the house, I could see Nathan's truck parked out front. The lights inside were on, casting a dim glow through the curtains. I crouched behind some bushes just out of sight and watched. At first, nothing happened. Minutes ticked by, and I wondered if I'd been wrong. Maybe they were just talking. Maybe I was overreacting. But then I saw them. Lizzie and Nathan standing in the living room. Her hands were on his chest, his fingers threaded through her hair. They were laughing, but it wasn't the kind of laugh you have with a friend. No, this was different. Intimate. And then, before I could even process what I was seeing, they kissed. It wasn't a chaste peck or a friendly goodbye kiss. It was the kind of kiss that spoke of desire, of lust, of something far deeper than just a fling. Lizzie pressed herself against him, and Nathan's hands roamed her body like they'd done this 100 times before. I should have stormed in right then, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, watching in disbelief as my wife, the woman I had married, the woman I had sacrificed so much for, betrayed me with another man. I stayed there, rooted in place, as they moved from the living room to the bedroom. The curtains were drawn just enough that I could still see the silhouette of their bodies through the thin fabric. The laughter faded, replaced by something else, something raw and undeniable. They weren't just having sex. They were enjoying it, lost in each other, oblivious to the fact that I was right outside, watching. A sickening wave of nausea hit me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was like watching a car crash, horrifying, but impossible to look away from. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more bitter than the last. How long had this been going on? How many nights had she lied to me, smiled at me, kissed me goodnight, all while carrying on this sordid affair with Nathan? The moments dragged on, each second amplifying the pain twisting in my gut. I wanted to burst into that room, rip them apart, scream in their faces, but instead I waited. I waited for them to finish, waited until the sounds of their betrayal died down, until Lizzie finally left Nathan's house and headed back to the life she was pretending to live with me. The next morning, Lizzie was back to her usual routine, sipping her coffee at the kitchen counter like nothing had happened. Her hair was still damp from the shower, her skin glowing with the kind of radiance I hadn't seen in months. She looked content, peaceful even, and it made me sick. I sat across from her, barely able to look her in the eye. My mind was a whirlpool of anger and disbelief, but outwardly I stayed calm. I had to. If I lost my cool now, everything I'd worked for would come crashing down. I needed to be smart about this. "So, how was last night?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. I was testing her, seeing how far she'd go with her lies. "Great," she said, flashing me a smile that used to make my heart skip a beat. Now, it just made me want to throw something. "Just hung out with the girls, had a few drinks. You know, the usual." I nodded, pretending to believe her. "Glad you had a good time." She went on about her plans for the day, another trip to the gym, maybe lunch with Helen and Ashley, then some work around the house with Nathan later. I clenched my teeth at the mention of his name, but again, I didn't let it show. I just smiled and nodded, like the fool she thought I was. That night, after Lizzie had gone to bed, I sat down at the kitchen table and made a plan. I wasn't going to confront her right away. That would be too easy, too impulsive. No, I was going to do this the smart way. I'd been a CFO for years. I knew how to play the long game, how to collect evidence, build a case. And this was no different. The first thing I did was hire a private investigator. I'd never imagined myself doing something like that, but desperate times called for desperate measures. If Lizzie was going to lie to my face, I needed hard proof, something she couldn't wiggle out of when the time came, something I could use in court. The PI was a no-nonsense guy named Matt, someone a friend had recommended. He listened as I told him everything: the late nights, the gym trips, Nathan. He didn't ask too many questions, just nodded and took notes. "I'll take care of it," he said after I'd finished. "Give me a week, maybe 2. I'll get you what you need." The waiting was brutal. Every day I came home, wondering if tonight would be the night Matt called with news, or if I'd catch Lizzie slipping up. But she was careful, too careful. I had to give her credit for that. She played the part of the dutiful wife, all the while sneaking around behind my back, continuing her affair with Nathan as if she had nothing to fear. But then, after 2 weeks of hell, Matt called. "You're not going to like this," he said, his voice gruff through the phone. "But I've got what you need. I'll send over the photos, videos, everything." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "What did you find?" "It's exactly what you think it is. They're having an affair, and it's been going on for a while. I've got them meeting up at his house, the 2 of them at the gym together, dinner dates, the works." I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the desk. I had expected this, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. "Send it over," I said, my voice tight. When the email came through, I almost couldn't open it. My hands shook as I clicked on the attachments: photos of Lizzie and Nathan together, their bodies entwined, their faces locked in passion. It was all there, captured in stark, undeniable detail. The dinners, the gym trips, the nights at his place, everything. I stared at the images, my chest tightening with rage and heartbreak. This was the woman I had built a life with, the woman I had loved, trusted, sacrificed for, and here she was, throwing it all away for a man who wasn't even half of what I'd been to her. But now I had the proof. The cold, hard evidence I needed to confront her, to expose her lies for what they were. This was war now, and I wasn't going to lose. The following day, I asked Lizzie to meet me for lunch. I was calm, collected, even a little charming, everything a husband should be. She didn't suspect a thing. She smiled and kissed me on the cheek when she arrived at the restaurant, completely unaware of what was coming. We made small talk, discussed the renovations, her daughters, the usual pleasantries, but the entire time I could feel the weight of the envelope in my pocket, the photos, the proof. I sat across from Lizzie at the small, upscale restaurant, the kind of place where we used to go before everything fell apart. She looked relaxed, even happy, sipping her wine and chatting like we were just a normal married couple with no troubles in the world. But today I wasn't interested in small talk, not anymore. As I watched her smile and laugh, I felt that cold, heavy envelope in my jacket pocket like a lead weight, the proof, the undeniable evidence of her betrayal, the photos, the videos, the emails, the culmination of all the lies she'd been feeding me for months. I could feel the anger bubbling inside me, threatening to spill over, but I kept my cool. This was going to be on my terms. Lizzie was halfway through telling me about some new idea for the house renovation when I interrupted her. "Lizzie," I said, my voice steady. "We need to talk." She blinked, surprised by the shift in my tone. "About what?" I reached into my jacket and pulled out the envelope, placing it on the table between us. The thick stack of evidence made a dull thud as it hit the polished wood, and I could see her eyes flicker down to it, curiosity quickly turning to unease. "What's that?" she asked, her voice faltering slightly. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, watching her. "Why don't you open it and find out?" Her hand hovered over the envelope for a moment before she finally picked it up. She hesitated, then slid her finger under the flap, pulling out the stack of photos and papers. The color drained from her face as she flipped through the images, pictures of her and Nathan in compromising positions, smiling and kissing like love-struck teenagers. Her eyes widened, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form words. What is this?" she whispered, her voice shaky. "What do you think it is?" I replied, my tone colder than I intended. "It's the truth, Lizzie, the truth you've been hiding from me for months." She stared at the photos, her hands trembling. "Charles, I can explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, my calm exterior finally cracking. "Explain how you've been sneaking around behind my back, fucking Nathan while telling me you were at the gym? Explain how you've been lying to me, to my face, every single day." "Go ahead, Lizzie, explain it." Tears welled up in her eyes as she shook her head. "It's not what it looks like." "I don't lie to me," I cut her off, slamming my hand on the table, drawing the attention of the other patrons. I didn't care. "I've seen everything. I have proof. This isn't some misunderstanding. Lizzie, you've been cheating on me, and now you're going to deal with the consequences." Her tears spilled over, and she wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Charles, please. I never wanted to hurt you." I laughed bitterly. "You didn't want to hurt me. You've been screwing another man in our home, Lizzie. You've been laughing with him, kissing him, while I've been breaking my back to keep our lives from falling apart. How the hell did you think this was going to end?" She didn't have an answer. Instead, she sat there, crying quietly, her head bowed as the weight of what she'd done sank in. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. When we left the restaurant, there was no yelling, no dramatic confrontation in the parking lot. Lizzie was too defeated, too ashamed to argue. I dropped her off at the house without another word, watching her walk up to the front door like a ghost, her shoulders slumped in defeat. As soon as she disappeared inside, I drove straight to my lawyer's office. I wasn't going to waste any time. Lizzie had betrayed me, lied to me, and humiliated me. I wasn't about to let her walk away from this without paying the price. My lawyer, James, was a sharp, no-nonsense kind of guy. He listened as I laid out the situation, flipping through the evidence I'd gathered with a grim expression. "This is more than enough to win the case," he said, looking up at me. "With these photos, the videos, and the texts, you have a solid case for infidelity. The court will likely rule in your favor." I nodded, feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. It wasn't much, but it was something. Lizzie had taken so much from me, my trust, my peace of mind, my dignity, but I wasn't going to let her take everything. I was going to fight back. James leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Do you want to go for alimony?" I hesitated. The thought of Lizzie taking more money from me, especially after what she'd done, made my blood boil. But then again, I wasn't a vindictive man. I just wanted out. "No," I said finally. "I just want the divorce. I want her out of my life." James nodded, making a few notes. "I'll get the paperwork started. It might take a little time, but given the circumstances, I don't see her putting up much of a fight." I left his office feeling both relieved and exhausted. The hard part was over. But the battle was just beginning. Over the next few days, Lizzie tried everything to get me to change my mind. She cried, she apologized, she promised that she would never see Nathan again, but it was too late. The damage was done. No amount of tears or apologies could undo what she had done. One night, a few days after I had served her with divorce papers, she showed up in the living room, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Charles, please," she begged, sitting down beside me on the couch. "I made a mistake. A horrible, terrible mistake, but I still love you. I don't want to lose you." I stared at her, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to forgive her and pretend like we could go back to the way things were, but the rational part of me, the part that had seen the photos, the videos, the betrayal with my own eyes, knew better. "It's over, Lizzie," I said quietly. "You can't undo what you did. I can't trust you anymore. You've destroyed us." Her face crumpled, and she collapsed into tears, but I didn't comfort her. I couldn't. All I felt was a hollow emptiness inside, like a part of me had died along with our marriage. "I'm sorry," she whispered through her sobs. "I'm so sorry, Charles. I never meant for this to happen." I stood up, unable to listen to her anymore. "Sorry doesn't change anything," I said, walking toward the door. "You made your choice, Lizzie. Now you have to live with it." The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, legal meetings, and awkward, tilted conversations with Lizzie. She moved into a spare room in the house while we worked out the details of the divorce, and every encounter between us was like walking through a minefield. Sometimes she'd try to talk to me, to explain or apologize again, but I'd just shut her down. There was nothing left to say. But as much as I tried to shut her out, I couldn't help but notice how everything seemed to unravel for her once the affair was exposed. Nathan, the man she'd thrown away our marriage for, had dropped her like a bad habit. I didn't know the details. Hell, I didn't want to, but it was clear that their little romance had been built on shaky ground. Once I found out, Nathan had no interest in being part of the fallout. Lizzie was left with nothing. No Nathan, no marriage, and soon no home. When the court finally ruled in my favor, it was almost anticlimactic. Lizzie lost the house, and the judge awarded me the bulk of our assets. I knew she hadn't expected it to turn out this way. She had always assumed she'd be the one to come out on top, to walk away with more than she deserved, but that wasn't how it played out. Helen and Ashley, her daughters, were old enough to choose who they wanted to live with. Surprisingly, they chose to stay with me. Despite all the bitterness between us over the years, they knew I had been there for them, providing, trying to be the best stepfather I could. They saw Lizzie for what she was: selfish, reckless, willing to burn everything to the ground for her own desires. In the end, Lizzie left the house with nothing but a few bags and her dignity in tatters. I watched as she drove away for the last time, feeling an odd sense of closure. It was over. Finally, it was over. In the quiet of the empty house, I sat on the back porch, nursing a glass of bourbon and staring out at the yard. The same yard where Nathan and Lizzie had once laughed and plotted, where my marriage had slowly disintegrated without me even realizing it. But now it was peaceful. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of relief. I had survived. The house was quiet now, almost eerily so. After Lizzie left, it was like a weight had been lifted, but in its place, there was an emptiness. The silence was both a relief and a reminder of everything that had happened. The rooms that once buzzed with tension and deceit were now still, but they carried the echoes of the past. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper with memories I didn't want to revisit. I sat at the kitchen table, a glass of bourbon in hand, staring at the empty seat across from me. That was where Lizzie used to sit, where she'd laugh and talk about renovations or plans for the future. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now there was just the sound of the clock ticking on the wall, marking the passage of time as I tried to figure out what the hell came next. The divorce had been finalized a few weeks ago. Legally, Lizzie was out of my life, but the emotional scars were still fresh. I'd been through heartbreak before, more times than I cared to admit. Patricia, my first wife, had left with our son over a decade ago, vanishing into the wind without so much as a goodbye. That wound had never really healed, and now Lizzie had done something worse, betrayed me in a way that cut deeper than abandonment ever could. I took a long sip of my drink, letting the warmth settle in my chest. Despite everything, I wasn't angry anymore. The rage that had burned inside me for so long had finally flickered out, leaving only a cold, tired acceptance. This was my life now, just me, this big, empty house, and a future I had no idea how to face. It wasn't all bad, though. After Lizzie left, I was surprised by how much Helen and Ashley stepped up. I had never been particularly close to them. They were Lizzie's daughters from her first marriage, and they had always treated me like an outsider. But when the dust settled, they stayed with me. It wasn't something I had expected, but I was grateful for it. They had seen the ugly side of their mother, the way she had lied and manipulated, and they wanted no part of it. Helen, the older of the two, was the first to break the silence between us. One night, after Lizzie had moved out, she came into the living room while I was watching TV. She sat down next to me, not saying anything at first, just staring at the screen. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. For what I asked, genuinely confused, I couldn't imagine why she would feel the need to apologize. For everything. For how we treated you, Mom. She made us think you didn't care, that you were just some guy who cared more about work than us. I turned to look at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "Helen, you don't have to apologize for any of that. You were kids, and Lizzie, well, your mom had her own way of seeing things." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I see it now. Everything she did, the way she treated you. And I feel so stupid for not seeing it sooner." I reached over and put a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. "Don't beat yourself up over it. We all get caught up in things we can't see until it's too late. What matters is that you're here now." She smiled through her tears, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of something good, a small flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe this was just the beginning of something new, something better. The weeks that followed were strange but oddly comforting. Without Lizzie's presence looming over the house, things started to settle into a new kind of normal. Helen and Ashley stayed with me for a while, helping around the house and keeping me company in ways I hadn't expected. They weren't my daughters, but for the first time, it felt like we were building something like a family. Ashley, the younger one, was more reserved. She didn't say much about what had happened, but I could tell she was angry. Angry at her mom for what she had done, angry at the way everything had fallen apart. But unlike Helen, who was quick to open up, Ashley kept her distance. She'd come home from school or work, head straight to her room, and barely speak a word to me. One night, I decided to break the ice. I knocked on her bedroom door, waiting for the faint come in before stepping inside. She was sitting at her desk, headphones on, sketching in a notebook. Art had always been her escape. "Hey," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Got a minute?" She pulled off her headphones and turned to face me, her expression guarded. "Yeah, what's up?" I hesitated, not sure how to start. "I just wanted to check in. See how you're doing. We haven't really talked much since everything?" She shrugged, fiddling with her pencil. "I'm fine." "Are you?" I pressed gently, stepping further into the room. "Because it's okay if you're not. I get it. This whole thing with your mom. It's a lot." Ashley didn't say anything for a long time. She just stared down at her notebook, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Then, finally, she spoke. "I hate her," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I hate what she did. I hate that she destroyed everything. And I hate that I didn't see it coming." I crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed, not wanting to push too hard. "You didn't deserve any of this, Ashley. None of it is your fault." Her eyes filled with tears, and she angrily wiped them away. "It doesn't matter. She ruined everything, and now you're stuck with us." I shook my head. "You're not stuck here. I want you here, both of you." She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine for any hint of dishonesty. "You really mean that?" "Yeah, I do," I said, my voice soft but firm. "This house doesn't feel right without you two in it. We've been through a lot, but that doesn't mean we can't move forward together." For the first time since the divorce, I saw a glimmer of something in Ashley's eyes, something like hope, like maybe, just maybe things could be okay again. As the weeks turned into months, I started to rebuild. Slowly but surely, I began piecing my life back together. The house no longer felt like a prison, no longer haunted by the specter of Lizzie and Nathan. Instead, it became a place of healing, a place where I could start over. I focused on my job too. The real estate market was still shaky, but things were stabilizing. The company had survived the worst of the crash, and I found myself diving headfirst into the work. It was a distraction, sure, but it also gave me a sense of purpose. After all the chaos, I needed something solid to hold on to. Then there was the Harley. My pride and joy. Lizzie had tried to take that from me during the divorce, but the court had ruled in my favor. One afternoon, I pulled the bike out of the garage, dusting off the chrome and polishing it until it gleamed in the sunlight. As I sat on the seat, feeling the familiar weight beneath me, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: freedom. I revved the engine, the deep growl of the motor vibrating through my bones. The open road called to me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I answered. I rode for hours, the wind whipping past me, the world blurring into a haze of motion and noise. It wasn't an escape, it was a release. As I rode, I thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the lies, the heartbreak. But instead of dwelling on it, I let it fall away, piece by piece, like dead leaves in the wind. I wasn't going to let Lizzie or Nathan or the pain of the past control me anymore. When I finally pulled back into the driveway, the sun was setting, casting the house in a golden glow. I took off my helmet, breathing in the cool evening air, feeling lighter than I had in months, maybe even years. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But I was still standing. I was still here. And that was enough. As I sat on the front porch that evening, a quiet peace settled over me. The worst was behind me now. The scars were still there, sure, but they didn't hurt as much anymore. They were just a reminder of what I'd been through, of what I'd survived. I looked out at the yard, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees, and smiled. Maybe, just maybe, I'd find happiness again. For now, that was enough.